Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many people of you here today in our lovely Climate and Energy College. My name is Winjan Vijayanuchit. I'm a PhD candidate here at Melbourne University Climate and Energy College, and I'm doing research in demand-side response, a fairly similar topics to family similar areas to today's topic. Before I give you an introduction of today's presenter, let me begin with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. I would also like to pay respects to elders past and present. Okay, our seminar here today, apart from Melbourne University Climate Energy College, we partner with the Energy Transition Hub, and this seminar is sponsored by Victorian Clean Energy Fund, and you can visit their website here. Today, it's my great honor to introduce Doug Cook. Doug has over a decade of experiences in energy and utility industries under his belt. He was a former British diplomat, policy advisor, and now it's very interesting to see that he has moved on to be at the forefront of the topical energy transition arena. His most recent consulting engagements included the successful investment case and delivery of Australia's largest virtual power plant. His talk today involves behind meter generations, flexible and decentralized energy system, and how can we get benefit from them. So the topic today is laying foundations today for the grid of tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, please make him very welcome, Doug Cook.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me all right. It's a very gracious introduction, and thank you very much to the college, Melbourne University, and of course to the Victorian Clean Technology Fund for having us here. It's very kind. Wow, this is amazing. I'm stunned I have so many willing participants. How many of you, just out of curiosity, are PhD students? Brilliant. Some of the ones in the back, quiet, nice one. How many of you are here as willing volunteers? Just curious. Interested? Brilliant. I'm going to try and pitch today's talk at an open public level. I'm not going to talk about the algorithms that GreenSync uses to optimize or co-optimize different generation technologies. If anyone's interested, please see one of my colleagues. If you're interested in energy and where it's going, if you're interested in energy policy in Australia, I'm sorry, I have no answers, but I'm hopefully going to raise some questions. Please do ask questions. I'm not a lecturer, and I would really welcome your thoughts and contributions. Raise your hand, thank you so much. Raise your hand if you've heard of GreenSync before. Anybody? Cool, good to hear. So we've been in Melbourne for 10 years, founded by Dr. Phil Blythe, PhD from this wonderful institution. In control systems, he was working in Boeing in the US in aerospace control, and one of his colleagues and friends, or so the story goes, told him that energy is where optimization was going to get really interesting. Apart from looking at these really infinitesimal gains in aircraft engines, actually in energy and society, we are horrible at energy efficiency, still to this day. So he founded GreenSync in 2010. We have a background in demand response. We have a background in software, basically. We do not control assets ourselves. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we see as trends in society and talk to you a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of our business case, if I'm quite frank, and where we think this is all going. No questions so far? Brilliant.
Yes, I'll throw one in. Just
please,
relevant.
Please.
My background is more biological and wondering where you go. Oh, right.
It's right. There's some people watching online, apparently. Yeah, I know. That's why
I hadn't anticipated that, or had forgotten that was a possibility. I'm just wondering, in these complex systems you'd have to integrate, whether biological models, ecosystems, and so on have parallels. After all, Mother Nature has been working quietly without any foresight at all in her laboratory for something like 3.5 billion years, and it's damned hard for humans to catch up and override her mistakes and so on. But there might be parallels, so I'll ask that now rather than later. Thanks.
Crikey. Thank you. In the deep end. I had the great privilege of seeing James Lovelock speak a few years ago in London about Gaia theories and how nature could be theoretically self-healing. I don't know. I'm not a climate scientist. I don't know to what extent nature could heal itself, but I do know that some of the swarm-based algorithms and some of the things that we're using in our software do directly replicate natural theories. So please don't ask me too many technical questions. I'm the head of delivery for GreenSync. It's my challenge and privilege to sell our software, to deliver our software, to make sure it works for customers all over the country and increasingly elsewhere in the world. But I'm afraid I can't comment on exactly how that works. But in theory, yes. In theory, absolutely. 6 things I thought I'd like you all to take away from my comments this morning. The first and foremost, given I'm speaking at a university, I thought I'd start with a few pretty graphs. The DER trends are startling. You will have seen them elsewhere, I'm sure, but it's just worth recapping perhaps why GreenSync thinks this is such an amazing opportunity, such an amazing time. Controversial statement of the morning, number 1, the flexibility we need in our system already exists. We're just not very good at accessing it. It's effectively why GreenSync exists. But there is an incredible network, a neural network almost, if you want to use a biological term, of assets that could be flexible if they were asked. The question is, we haven't been very good at asking. The problem is we haven't been very good at asking the question, and we certainly haven't been very good at rewarding it, which is going to be my next point. Another controversial one for an economist, especially one who's seen the huge cross subsidies of everybody who has solar PV. Everyone has solar PV? Anyone? Anyone? A few? Brilliant. Not the PhD students. Don't worry, nor do I. Economic argument being that if you have solar PV, you are effectively benefiting from the rooftop, and you are getting a sort of a net gain from the grid, to the detriment of people who don't have PV, who are bearing more of the cost of the grid system. This gets super controversial in policy world. You know, if somebody buys an EV, should they be paid for the EV's flexibility to support the grid? My theoretical argument is yes, because it's actually a social good that they're delivering. But I appreciate that that is a fairly controversial one. Henry T. Ford very famously said that customers can have Model Ts in any color so long as they're black. Right? He was horribly wrong. His marketing people hated him for it, and eventually the Model Ts were rolling off the line in every color, including black. I'm going to make this argument about DER, about systemic diversity. I'm not going to deliberately allude to biological terms for the entire talk, but there is some really important concepts buried in here. If you go ask a technical engineer, including some of GreenSync staff, what is the right way to solve the problem? They'll come at it respectfully, as an engineer would. They'll think of the most beautiful and optimized design, and they'll argue that should be implemented across the piece. Australia has already developed some fantastic tiny DER technologies. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Watt Watchers, Switched In, Reposit, you name it. If you could look at the worldwide, you're looking at Blue Pillars, Jellies, Teslas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a classic engineering solution. Buy my thing, apply my widget. It's the answer. It's a panacea. It's a silver bullet. I'm sorry, I don't believe that's true. As an economist, something that pains me to my core, not a libertarian, don't worry, markets alone won't hack it. There's been a lot of talk from AMO, among others. Don't worry, the market will solve this. Don't worry, we do markets. We're the market operator. We've got it. GreenSync's perspective is, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. We've been working with distribution businesses, doing all kinds of RIT-D, if you're in the industry, effectively delaying investments in poles and wires using demand-side response for 8 years. The market alone is not sufficient. You need to have a really good understanding of low-level physics. And finally, I've tried to find a little picture, a cartoon with somebody holding a lump of coal in Parliament. Snide joke as a foreigner, I appreciate. Policy would be great. I was just commenting to some of the colleagues who kindly introduced me. GreenSync has been able to make leaps and bounds in Australia because there is no policy. We get on with doing it, and then we wonder when somebody's going to come along and tell us to keep our fingers off. But for us to do what I think we need as a society, and please remember I'm trying to juggle my GreenSync hat versus my trying to be a decent human being hat, as a society, we need policy. And the absence of policy in Australia over the last decade has been startling. So I promised you I'd start with some stunning graphs. DNVGL, also known as KEMA elsewhere in the world, pretty renowned engineering consultancy, pointing out that by 2050, something like 70% of energy capacity will be solar and wind. On the right-hand side of each of these graphs, I've put in a so what, if you're not graphically inclined. Who cares? The short form answer in this one is that we're going to need more macro flexibility. Software platforms like ours create macro flexibility. They allow things to vary, demand side, in keeping with what the supply side is providing. If you have more solar and wind, you need more flexibility. This is a really fun one that's been around the traps. All Energy this year, this was presented at least a dozen times in different lectures. AEMO and the ENA, the Energy Networks Australia, collaboration on the Open Networks project, talking about the amount of generation from behind the meter. Their assumption is that by 2030, it'll be approximately 45% of all generation will no longer be big rotating masses. Sorry, goodbye coal-fired power stations. Increasingly, generation behind the meter. Interestingly, the word generation is also a massive misnomer. What is generation? Anyone care to hazard a guess?
Capture.
Maybe, yeah, that's part of it for sure. It's highly diverse. This concept of generation. Solar PV, rooftop PV is going to make up a huge part of it, of course it is. One of my favorite little stats that I heard the other day, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Australia represents 0.3% of the world's population, but in the coming year will represent 1/3 of global residential battery sales. That's astonishing. So capturing that energy and putting it back into the grid at the right time will become increasingly important. We're going to require more flexible supplies. We need a way to aggregate this and control it in a way that doesn't do harm. EVs, slightly funny topic standing here in Australia, because frankly, you don't see very many. But I was in Norway not too long ago. I'm a keen runner. I went for a run in Oslo and almost got bowled over. They have 28% EVs. The city is noticeably quieter. I don't know if anyone's been in Tokyo recently. Ditto. A lot of plug-in hybrids, a lot of much smaller ICE. There's still petrol engines, but much smaller engine cars. As we get more and more EVs in our system, we will have very odd grid requirements. And by odd, I'm not going to talk too much today about duck curves because I appreciate I'm probably preaching to the choir. But the challenge with EVs is their aggregation and what they do intertemporally, i.e. when they move around. I'll come on to that in a moment. And this is a slide that our Chief Technology Officer insists on me putting in here. I put what he says, and then I put what I say in brackets. Most new distributed energy resources are native IoT. All right, great. In real English, that means that they could talk to each other if they knew what to say. Right? In theory, each of us could take out our mobile phones and ring each other. But the critical delta is that we ring each other. We actively have an action. This gentleman here wants to ring this gentleman here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that they are native IoT in and of themselves does not mean that they automatically communicate. We are not talking neural networks. We're not talking amazing functionality. We're talking the ability to communicate. So the gap that GreenSync fills is bringing these different macro trends together and encouraging and allowing these technologies to communicate, which we think is the future of demand-side response. All right. Bit wordy slide, I've got to be honest, but I figured that some of you might like the slides afterwards and you can have a think about what I'm saying. When I've been describing this to policymakers, and bear in mind that is my background, I talk about it as generations of problems. There are approximately 6 panels a minute installed in Australia today. The problems of rooftop PV, and I am going to focus on the problems for a second because it's more interesting, are going to increase. I'm going to come on to exactly how those problems appear and what they do in just a second. But that problem is now. If you ask AEMO, just for a second, about operational demand in South Australia, they will demonstrate this graph. This is from a presentation they gave in December of 2017, please bear in mind. So it's already close to 2 years out of date, well, a year and a half out of date. This is 0, the middle of the page. Operational demand is when demand in society exceeds AEMO's ability to supply it safely. So what they're basically saying is that solar PV in the middle of the day satisfies so much of demand, it's actually forcing the assets which stabilize the grid, specifically rotating masses, out. That happened 5 times in December 2018, that they had to declare some description of LOR, LOR2, etc., because what they were finding is they could no longer maintain a harmonized frequency. Geeky engineering talk for AEMO, having a really hard time. This is a problem today. The next problem we're going to come to is aggregated storage. This is GreenSync. We know quite a lot about this. We control VPPs on behalf of our customers, and we license software to people to control VPPs all over the country. Very famously, AGL controlled a fleet of SunVerge batteries in a place called Salisbury Plain in South Australia. And just before a storm was coming over, they got all those batteries to charge, increasing resilience, making sure the households stay connected, all the good things that we'd like to see. Sapin reported afterwards that the damage done by the peak in demand of the charging was worse than the damage done by the storm. That was 120 residential batteries in one suburb. I'm sure I don't need to remind you that the South Australian government has promoted 90,000 residential batteries into Greater Adelaide effectively, with a few in countryside. The national government, if Labor gets in, has promised some other astronomical number. The Labor government here in Victoria is talking a significant number in conjunction with its new solar program, etc. I love the idea of aggregated storage because it's what pays my salary. But I am genuinely worried about what happens when you have huge fleets of residential batteries being controlled by VPP operators, we're going to have to talk about this at lunch, with no oversight, with no understanding or consequence of what happens on the network. And that is the situation today. We're just touching the tip of the iceberg of this, and I want it to be controversial in today's talk. So my generation 2 problem, which is probably coming in the next 5 years, is the aggregation, the large-scale aggregation of fleets of assets. Tesla want to roll out all the batteries they can. They've already got 1,000 in Adelaide. They're pushing the numbers pretty quickly. Their supply chain's tight, but they're going to get there. Unless they can communicate more effectively with the distribution business, they're going to actually cause serious problems. And finally, EVs. So again, for the non-technical, 1 electric vehicle equals roughly 5 residential batteries with wheels and a steering wheel. The problem with this one is similar to this one, but this problem is mobile. If you imagine society in the very, very macro high level, pretend you're God sense for a second. EVs are parked in suburbia in the evening. They're charging in suburbia in the evening. But in the evening, PV output on those roofs is negligible to 0. Then they drive into wherever it is they're going to be during the day. Melbourne University, Parkville, CBD, you name it. Probably multi-story car parks. Probably places where people want to be. This creates locational challenges. We don't have a huge amount of PV in the city. We don't have a huge amount of PV in Parkville. We do have a huge amount of PV in suburbia. So you've got effectively an inverse correlation problem between generation 1 and generation 3. You've got all this PV in suburbia pushing out electrons during the day. Please take me, take me, take me. AEMO's got a problem. Come the evening, all those electric vehicles return to base or home or whatever you want to call it, your apartment, and struggle to charge. Generation 3 problem. Why generation 3? Because let's be frank, in Australia, it's going to take at least a decade before we have massive scale uptake of EVs. Elsewhere in the world, this problem, London, my home originally, this is already a thing today. Victorian infrastructure, charging loads, etc., intertemporal charging. But in Australia, it's going to create some really interesting challenges around the confluence with Gen 1. All right, showed you that graph. Markets must address the physics. Can't stress this enough. I have engineering colleagues in my team who bang on about this blind. There's been a huge debate in the public that will probably continue about the relationship between DSOs, which for those of you who are less sort of industry geek than I am, distribution businesses, the people who physically own the poles and wires, and organizations like AEMO. GreenSync doesn't take sides. We contribute to the consultations. We respond to the various documents they put out in the public. We love the fact that they've started to talk about orchestration, adding huge value to assets. All of this is true and correct, but it's become something overtly political, which frankly it never should have been. Probably should have been a technocrat conversation in a dark corner somewhere, where we have identified the DSOs know the LV physics best, so they must maintain system security. And market operators, ASX, AMO, other similar institutions, are best at the financial side, and so probably best sticking to their knitting, as my mum would say. All right. Now this is where it gets interesting and everybody starts to take pictures. I've tried to do a bit of a compare and contrast over the last 10 years. Please don't take this as the gospel. This is Doug's highly subjective view on where we've been. Way back in the day, this little company called GreenSync, way back in the day, 2008, 2016, made VPPs. What is a VPP? At its core, this bilateral control mechanism. Gentleman in the tan jacket would like to control everybody else's batteries. Gentleman in the tan jacket pays everybody else for that control. We make a software. We license it to gentleman in tan jacket. Forgive me, I don't know your name. And he controls everybody else below. There's a heap of companies out there that do this now. AutoGrid out of California, very impressive. 2 Stanford professors got out in the great wide world and made a shed load of money. Enbala from Canada, again, deep respect. Smarter Grid Solutions is a Scottish company. We talk to all these people, we see them at conferences, they're all highly credible. Enenoc, now called NLX if you're a pedant. Schneider, couldn't find their logo this morning on Google, but just roll with it. 2014, the assets fought back. Instead of the gentleman in the tan jacket wanting to control all of your assets irrespective of what they were, which is kind of this technology, now the assets themselves make VPPs. If you buy a Tesla Powerwall 2 today, it has a computer in it. It has a 4G modem in it, and it is communicating 15 data streams live and real time to Tesla in America, whether you like it or not. Forget privacy, forget what tinfoil hat brigade. That's a thing. We are seeing what we in the industry, internally in the industry, describe as monoculture VPPs. Famous examples, Tesla, we work with them. They're nice people, their batteries are pretty cool, but yes, they're very good at marketing. Reposit, based up in Canberra, did fantastic work down in Bruny Island with University of Tasmania, among others. Jelly's gone a little bit quiet in the Australian market recently. They do a lot of battery optimization type stuff. They are monoculture VPPs, a single technology or asset, becoming increasingly powerful. From an engineer's perspective, this is awesome because you can get really, 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 really good at optimization if you're dealing with a monoculture. If every asset behaves the same, you can swarm extremely effectively. This is the stuff where GreenSync spends most of our time today. We identify this, pays my salary. We identify this, not really our space, but pretty cool. Flexibility marketplaces. How do we cope with what Henry T. Ford didn't say, which is the fact that society is inherently diverse? How do we cope with the fact that actually there's going to be a huge range of technologies and a huge range of price appetites, a huge range of ways to communicate with human beings? We're just starting to see some instances of this out in the great wide world. I've chucked PowerLedger up on here over in WA because they're a somewhat local example. They're peer-to-peer blockchain-y trading type people, but they're starting to think the same way. And we've done a few collaborations with them informally. In the great wide world, we've got a company called Electron based in London. Piclo used to be called Open Energy, I think it was, also in London. And Nodes, which is actually Nord Pool, which is a wholesale power trading market in Europe, getting in on this game as well. The challenge with these ones is that they're super, super early stage and they can't really support high densities. This is a scaling problem. Anyone who's into computer science will tell you it's relatively easy to make a program that can do a certain number of functions on a relatively small data set. In London, there are 7,500 EV charge points, all of which require optimization at the same time. And we're very fortunate that GreenSync was recently selected to run the software behind that. So we're dealing in very, very large, very, very, very large data sets. It brings with it a very specific problem of its own. So what am I getting to? We need an open platform. I genuinely think, like the poles and wires, somebody at some point is going to select a winner. Really controversial. Policymakers hate picking winners. Existentially goes against the grain. But much like the poles and wires themselves, we need some singularity. It's got to be grid protecting. I hope I've made that point. Unless you take into account the physics, we've got a real problem. It's got to be middleware, right? You've got to bring these VPPs and DERMs and DROMs and all the other industry acronyms. You've got to bring them together in such a way that they are able to compete, and I use that word quite guardedly, on an open playing field, but creating the visibility to the grid. And finally, market enabling. Why? Win, this one's just for you. I tried to have a crack at the numbers. I trained as an economist many years ago. Please don't cite these in your papers. It's my go, right? I went along and said, what is this actually going to do? Why should you guys, hopefully, after this discussion and your difficult questions, which I'm sure will follow, why should you carry on thinking about this the rest of today and talk about it with your mates? Firstly, dynamic export limitations. Right, here we go. Technical again, sorry. At the moment, in most of Australia, there's a 5 kilowatt export limit on most residential homes in the country. There are very few sandboxes in South Australia, among others, where you can export more than that. But frankly, between us, that's complete sham. Why 5? Why 5 on a constant basis? It's a lie. There are a limited number of times in the year when the distribution business does genuinely need you to be under 5 kilowatts export. There's a very limited number of times in the year when the distribution business would rather you weren't exporting at all. That's what we call curtailment. If you remove these export restrictions on the solar installs that are being done today, right? And you apply a very conservative payment for the export of that solar. So I've used less than the feed-in tariff, 0.08 cents per kilowatt hour. That's worth about 30 million per annum to society of effectively free electricity, right? That's curtailment that is being curtailed today that could otherwise be opened up. Managing storage and solar.
Can I just check, sir?
Please. By all means, sir. You are hot in the questions. Just hang on with the microphone. There we go. Wins on it. Brilliant.
Look, just to clarify, that's a potential gain, or is that 30 million an existing cost?
This 30, that's a really good question. This is, as I said, Doug numbers, so please take them with a pinch of salt. The PV panels that are being rolled out today are actively being curtailed, whether it's by the inverter trip settings, whether it's by the distribution business not allowing you to exceed a certain percentage. Sapin and City Power Powercore both recently issued letters to residents in their respective distribution areas saying that they could not, inverted commas, put PV on their roofs for particular reasons. And the reason is that on a very limited number of hours of the day, that house couldn't have exported. But that's a bad judgment for you as a human being. If I come home in my street and I see everybody else has PV, and I'm saying, well, hang on a second, why can't I have PV? That is a net bad outcome. So what I did is say, what happens if you could lift that restriction? And that's what I calculated it as. Why? Because I assumed that that person, yourself, myself, whoever it may be, would have gone ahead and bought those panels. So it's effectively a social good to the public that we would have more solar in the system and we'd be able to accept and tolerate that. I assume there's 200 megawatts of solar, just to make the numbers, which is very conservative. If you look at the numbers of panels that are being rolled out today in Australia, 200 megs is nothing. Please.
And you've netted out the times when they couldn't supply. So
I've just assumed that, yeah, there are a very limited number. Again, we spend a lot of time watching the markets, and we have software that actively controls network feeders and substations. So we're pretty well informed in a very agnostic sense, because they're not our assets, as to actually how many times in the year the grid is genuinely constrained. It's a looming threat, of course, but actually today, tomorrow, next week, the problem for distribution businesses is they must be conservative. As far as they're concerned, it's the introduction of risk. So they'd rather say no to you today than maybe to you and then deal with the consequence for a decade or 20 years. Storage, everybody in the industry likes to talk about value stacking. It's kind of the cool term of the moment. I said, you know what, forget that. Let's just assume there's a 10% improvement in the business case on the $1 billion that Bloomberg New Energy Finance thinks will be spent in residential batteries in the coming years, year on year. Every year, 1 billion Australian dollars. 10% improvement in the storage case is 100 million per annum. What is this improvement coming from? It's helping to manage that dispatch. Right? This isn't a talk about the optimization of batteries. If you have questions, please let me know. But basically, most batteries do behind the meter arbitrage. They soak up solar from the roof, and you get to use it in the evening. End of story. Whereas what I'm saying is actually, if you could use those batteries to help the grid, and you could be paid for that, that is to the benefit of the consumer, that is to the benefit of the people who own the batteries, to the tune of $100 million per year. That's not too bad. Avoiding capital assets. Right, the first term I learned when I moved to Australia in 2017 was gold plating. Everyone know what gold plating is? I see some wry smiles. I'd never heard that before. Gold plating? They gold plate the network? Why? Turns out they just like to spend lots of money, especially taxpayers' money. I assumed, and I took this from Ausgrid, Sapin, and a couple other distribution businesses that are currently going through their reg reset, that there's going to be about $10 billion of annual spend across Australia. These are really rounded numbers. As I say, please don't cite. I said, if DER, could do just 0.5% avoidance, I'm being super conservative even on myself, that's worth $50 million a year. Not bad. Diving into network reliability for a second. GreenSync's quite famous for a project down in the Mornington Peninsula. We control fleets of DER in the Mornington Peninsula to offset a $30 million capital network upgrade to the lines, medium voltage lines that run down towards Sorrento. SAIDI and SAIFI, somewhat geeky terms for keeping the lights on. I said, what happens if DER were able to create a 1-minute reduction in SAIDI at NEM consumption? It's worth about $17 million per annum. This is where it's getting a little bit network technical, but one of my engineering colleagues quite likes this calculation. What you're basically saying is that you're able to use DER to optimize and improve the delivery of power. That delivery of power comes from frequency, from harmonization, but also from the absolute voltage at the low voltage level. So pretty big deal. We proved, I don't know how many of you guys remember, way back to the dark days of the 26th of January, we had rolling blackouts across Victoria. GreenSync kept Mornington Peninsula alight for UE, which was kind, using our assets that were down there, our DER. We kept them on for about 6 hours on a rolling basis. We couldn't save everybody, that some UE was still shuttering houses left and right. But we were able to prove that we delivered a very significant value down there using DER. It's quite fun. And then finally, we get into the one which always raises eyebrows, and I hope you guys are going to ask some questions about data. Imagine that Tesla Powerwall that I just told you about. You go and buy one. Not in Bunnings yet, but not far from it. That's generating 15 data streams up to Tesla HQ. Do you know what Tesla HQ does with that information? Beg pardon? I wish they did, because then it would have value. They do nothing with it at all. They absorb terabytes of data a day and do nothing with it. What do they know? They know the voltage in your garage. They know the phasing. They know the power quality. They know the temperature. They know how much the battery is receiving from the panel. It's like the inverter technically, but and so that information has value. I am a huge advocate of consumer privacy. I certainly don't want Tesla, of all people, knowing about me or my family. But I do genuinely think there is value in that information that as a society we could access. So I said, let's say we have 5 million data streams at $10 per annum. What's 5 million data streams? Half the number of connected NIMIs in this country. Arbitrary, I appreciate. You give 50% back to customers, i.e. Tesla and their greedy paws keep 50%, which is extreme, but hey, who knows? 50% goes back to customers. That's a social value of $50 million per year. There's a lot of things going on. Oh, gentlemen, yes, sir.
Can I just break in again?
Please.
You know, my overall knowledge is broad, but extremely micro thin in a whole range of things. And it has been said by some philosopher that the proper study for mankind is man. And human brains are behind this. One significant guy is Elon Musk. You've no doubt heard of him. Now, are we seeing that behaviour in Tesla a manifestation of his, well, inevitably of his mental processes? And he seems to pretty largely call all the shots in Tesla and associated companies. Are we seeing a function of his propensity for secrecy? He doesn't trust the rest of the world, and I can see why he wouldn't in many cases. You might like to comment.
I can't comment on Elon Musk's propensity for secrecy, I'm afraid. I quite like Tesla for what it's worth, because I do genuinely think that his marketing machine is helping to change the world. I can't comment on the man's personal actions and don't intend to.
It's a bit of a pity, really, that he seemingly stands head and shoulders over whatever 95% of humanity in terms of intellectual and whatever physical organisation. Now, our politicians here are sort of in the dark ages, which you'll probably already have worked out, and we're not getting that kind of potential and the potential for interaction with other similarly or almost as bright people around the globe. That, to me, that sense of distrust, which goes back to tribal days and so on.
I'm a great believer in the diversity of society and humanity. I don't put too much emphasis on the man. Frankly, his kit's not even that good. Let's be frank. There's better technology out there. He's just got a good marketing machine.
Sorry to interrupt, guys. From now on, so please keep the questions or the questions at the end of the talk.
Thanks, Ben, no worries. I've only got a few more slides to go, and then it's open season. So what's GreenSync working on? This is something which has been in the press a little bit recently. We're the very gracious recipients of a fairly significant amount of money from ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. DEX, otherwise known as the Distributed Energy Exchange, is really trying to bring all this stuff together. What we've basically done is, what I've done this morning, is put our old products and some of our old concepts around the outside, just to point out that each of these could still operate in isolation, and tried to summarize, I'm afraid the slide isn't particularly sharp, but I hope you can still read it, why this is of actually value to each institution and organization. So virtual power plants today, gentleman in tan jacket example, beg your pardon, going out there and contracting you all, might not have seen Win. Win wasn't available to him. I'm pointing at Win over there just to make it obvious, right? Point being, through a marketplace, you could have controlled more assets than you controlled yesterday. You are more aware of what's out there. If you're a network and you're living in fear of solar PV, or you're not aware of what's going on behind the meter, which by the way is the case for most networks, you have the opportunity to contract distributed energy resources to provide a service. You didn't know they were there. Now you can see them and you can contract them to do something on your behalf. That is net good for you. I mean, you don't have to spend as much money on poles and wires. It's net good for society. If you're a complicated industrial user, again, GreenSync has some background in this. We have done various large VPP type projects with customers. You can improve the returns on your assets. It's really easy, in fact, it's a little too easy, to knock big mining companies in this country. But actually, they have incredible flexibility. If you ask a gold extraction company, just for the sake of discussion, to curtail their load on Tuesday afternoons between 4 and 6, because it's for the good of the community down the road, the chances are they'll ask you how much you're going to pay, and then they'll do it. But historically, no one's ever asked them. So GreenSync's really interested in exploring this, the link to industrial buildings and sites. Homes, this is just a staggering explosion of technology. Does anyone here have a Google Home? Amazon Alexa? Mobile phone? Right? The amount of information about your energy use that's at your fingertips, the number of companies, Solar Analytics, I went to speak to those guys the other day. Stefan Jansson and his colleagues, incredible the stuff they're able to do with the data and provide it back to you or sell it back to you or whatever. Really, really interesting. Where are they going to get that information? Hopefully places like this, middleware that sits behind the scenes. Fleet managers, this is particularly looking at fleets of EVs, if I'm frank, right? Not something we're dealing with here, but we've got a project going on in New Zealand at the moment where we're looking at integrating huge numbers of EV charge points for the municipality. Very interesting. And finally, everybody's favorite word in the energy industry, alongside blockchain, which is my other cross to bear. Peer-to-peer, right? Peer-to-peer in Australia does not make sense today, economically. Sorry to break all of your hearts. But at some point in the near future, it will. And it will make sense when the distribution businesses are able to vary their charging, what we call micronodal charging. If you're an economist like myself, trading your exported energy or frankly your capacity to somebody else. But how are you going to know that the capacity is available, and how are they going to know what you're prepared to pay for it? Again, it requires some technology behind the scenes. So what is DEX? It's a digital exchange, right? It enables physical contracts. We have live contracts running through it that are entirely digitized. Just makes it a lot faster, right? For the lawyers out there, if there are any lawyers in the room, what we've effectively done is pre-written 99% of the contract, and the parties, everybody, can trust the exchange. It doesn't intend to do anything. They're there. It enables multiple markets at once. You could have a market, quote unquote, for EV charging on your street, while you could also have a market for United Energy to curtail load in the Mornington Peninsula. And the two don't necessarily overlap, but they do compute physics in the same way, i.e. your charging behavior appears in the market and vice versa. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for GreenSync's perspective, we're a software company, after all, it's digital. So any party can, in theory, log on through their respective portal and see how DEX is treating their asset, or see how DEX is treating them. We don't make user interfaces. I can't bring up my phone and show you a pretty app that's GreenSync in action. Sorry. We make APIs, advanced programming interfaces. Yeah, so we build software behind the scenes, middleware, and we tack it into other people's software. Good way to think about this, if you're not IoT native, is apps on your phone. It's a very similar concept. We lie behind it. We're the app store. You don't need us necessarily until you do, and we're there behind the scenes facilitating transactions. And finally, we work directly with the distribution businesses to enforce physics rules. Right? So the distribution businesses run software platforms, very commonly called ADMS or DMS in Australia, made by Schneider and ABB and GE. So we work directly with them to understand what's the capability of the network. 3 layers, won't bother. Key takeaways, I started with a slide. I'll finish with the summaries and conclusions, and then you've got some time for questions. The trends are startling. Yes, that's nice. If we don't take action in the not too distant future, it will cost us more as a society, both in terms of capital efficiency, but also in terms of where poles and wires are built. We have the flexibility already. I wish I could do you a bit more practical demonstration. You have to come to GreenSync offices for that. It just needs to talk more effectively. Right? The things can talk to each other. We just need to find a way for them to communicate in a more effective way. Ford was wrong about the Model T's color range. I hope I've hammered that enough by now. Society is already choosing diverse assets. Some people like Teslas, some people don't. Some people like LG chems. Frankly, it doesn't matter. My mum is obsessed with the BMW i3. I don't know why. It looks like a bubble. It doesn't drive very well, but it's what my mum likes. My point being, society is going to go that way, much like mobile phones. If you think back 15 years, if you wanted a mobile phone, you got a contract. The contract was for a particular handset. That whole concept has disappeared. Society has moved on. People will choose their own DER. Markets alone won't hack it. There's a lot of people who talk about the merits of flexibility markets. Well, hey, great. Economist to me, starts to cheer. But actually, the physics is hugely important. DER owners can and should, in my humble view, get dollars for their flexibility. It is cheaper than poles and wires. We've now proven that in the Mornington Peninsula with a $30 million project. We can assure you it is cheaper. Yeah, policy, yeah, couldn't resist. I know there's an election coming up. I know voting is compulsory in this country, but energy policy would be genuinely lovely. Thank you so much. One right behind you. Win, are you going to facilitate, or do you want me to pick on people? I don't mind. I'm happy to choose. I'll take them in turn, please.
Thanks very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I'm interested to know your thoughts on what changes need to be made in the energy market by players such as the AEMC and AEMO. I know you've said that markets alone won't hack it, but I'm assuming that along the lines of what you're talking, these sorts of changes will require significant changes to the market structure. I'd be interested to hear on which direction do you think it needs to go and how that process might actually be put in place?
Wow, fantastic question. I'm sure there are many in here who are more familiar with AEMO's nuts and bolts than I am. We've been involved in the AEMO ENA discussions in Australia. I've also had the privilege of being involved in the Ofgem ENA discussions in the UK. Everybody's going around the same conversation at the moment. Here, there were 3 models. I don't know if you're familiar with the consultation paper. They recently introduced the 4th model, the hybrid model. That's the one we like best, privately, subjectively. What are the fundamental changes? The first fundamental change is one of fidelity and data quantity. So one of our former colleagues at GreenSync, who's just recently left us to go back to AEMO, worked on the original NEMD algorithms. How many different generation points and nodal transmission distribution points that formula can accept, inverted commas, before it falls down sideways. The number is staggeringly large. But then Lars is his name, and I sat over a beer and we said, right, well, what happens if every 3rd home in Australia had some form of DER? What is the quantitative number? And we came up with like 16 times 10 to the 28 or something ridiculous calculations per minute. We're like, hang on a second, NEMD and everything that's associated with it just couldn't cope at a national level with that. And what's more, it also can't cope with the constraint equations. How would NEMD know what a particular pole between this building and the building next door or a wire or whatever is able to deal with? So what we felt, highly subjectively, is that the distribution businesses must play a larger role than they do today in that future. Ideally, aggregating up the net impacts on their system and providing those to AEMO in some way. But then you get into an information asymmetry trap, because at the moment, the distribution businesses know nothing about the operation of VPPs. And from commercial reasons, they can't. They're regulated bodies, they're regulated monopolies. If you go talk to AGL, who happen to be one of GreenSync's customers, and you say, hi everybody, we're here to talk to you today about your VPP. They'll say, right, that's commercially confidential, sorry. So there's a very real and frankly correct challenge in bringing that together. That's one of the things we like to think DEX does. And we've been involved with Violette and the AEMO team in terms of how this market evolution might happen. So granularity, fidelity, ability to perceive what's going on at the LV network. And finally, participant management. Does anyone want to hazard a guess how many participants there are in the NEM today? Please, ballpark. Anybody? Hazard a guess. Come on, PhD students, be brave. Yes, ma'am, please. Yeah, I don't know the answer. I was hoping you'd go in that range. I reckon about 400. I reckon, but please don't take that as gospel. There's more than that in one of GreenSync's VPPs. That's not trying to be proud. That's just trying to say I don't actually know how AEMO would do the balancing and settlement that they do today when the numbers are so much larger. So that, again, will require an evolution in our thinking of markets. We, GreenSync, I'm really quite geeky about this. We've written some white papers. If you're interested, please come see me afterwards and we can have a bit of a chat about what flexibility exchanges, which is the critical thing, and then the markets, which we think are sort of Russian doll style, how that would look and feel. But a brave new world. And GreenSync is really proud, and we're proud that we're here in Melbourne, of course, that we're helping to lead this conversation worldwide. So you're next. And then I saw a question somewhere at the back. I'll come to you in a sec, please.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm from Red Energy. So my question is about, so you said about the APIs and so the platform that you have developed for that. So my question is how the companies make their hardware compatible with this platform, and how they are actually how they welcome this opportunity, and how many of them are now joining this platform to be empirical for the rollout to actually the main question is how theoretical is now and how practical it is.
I'll do my best. This is a slide that I skipped over, so please forgive me. I would have answered this exact question. DEX has 3 layers. From a technical perspective, they are inseparable, and I'll explain why in a second. But the most important layer to your question is DEX Connect. DEX Connect is a free, publicly available API. If you would like it, or Red would like it, or for that matter, if your colleagues would like it, just let us know. We have 85 partners in industry from around the world who are currently either working with or building to our API. Right, so we've already got Tesla, Watt Watchers, and a couple of other companies who are commercially confidential, integrated, assets deployed, index, commercially operating today. We have another 8, Fronius, Enphase, SolarEdge, and a couple of others whose names escape me temporarily, that are integrating. And we're doing a whole bunch overseas. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, for example, is integrated in Japan. This is free.
Sorry, so they provide the gadgets required for, for example, I'm getting an inverter from Fronius or whatever. So yeah, they provide themselves the gadget that make it compatible to your API. Is that the case?
No, our working assumption is that they're going to be selling the gadgets anyway.
Right.
So what we've done is create a series of APIs that are both related to the IEEE 2030.5 and the OpenADR 2.0 standards, both of which, just to be clear, are very low common denominators. They're rubbish. And so what we've done is try and raise the bar in terms of what assets should communicate. We're getting closer to what Rule 21 is doing in California. We're trying to get the assets to communicate and speak to each other nicely. I'm not the most technical person in the room, but I'll try. Right? Why? Because then we can create visibility. This is a software layer that GreenSync licenses to distribution businesses. It allows them to see, literally, what's going on in the network. The AER thinks this is a really good idea because it allows the networks to, or encourages the networks to accept more DER in the network. So South Australia Power Networks, for example, licenses this. And finally, and this is perhaps to your question, man behind, the most sort of sexy, cool, innovative, forward-thinking, advanced layer. This exists. This is licensable today. And this is what we're working on at the moment, which is how, if you create a transaction with Win, just for the sake of discussion, you agree a price, your asset has done something, and it has changed state on the network. So I've divided them intellectually into 3 layers, but actually the software platform communicates internally and says, yes, sir, I understand that Red Energy controlled a VPP on your asset. It paid you this amount of money. The status changed. The network can see it, approves it. The asset is signaled. The asset does something, etc. It's fairly complex stuff. Please don't think I'm trying to bend your brains, but yes.
So for the top layer, so you should be waiting for that model from AEMO to be, accomplished. It's mature and goes out to the market. Is that the case?
This is where we love the fact there's no policy in Australia, right? There's no policy. We're just getting on and doing it. My advice, my warm advice to my AEMO colleagues, and I do see them every other week, so I would say this to their face, and I have done, is that they have a crack. They have a trial. GreenSync is petrified of trials because commercially it's devastating. We jokingly refer to death by pilot. Every distribution business wants to do a pilot. Well, that's great, except they need the full stack of technology to work to prove the pilot. So I've got to hire all of my engineers and software coders and developers and architects and all that jazz, and they want to pay $150,000 for it. Well, hang on a second. So what we're saying, and interestingly, we're getting more traction in this space internationally, ironically, because of the lack of policy. AEMO, COAG, you asked about the number of different institutions. When I first came to Australia, one of my dear Australian friends said to me, Doug, you need to understand AFL. I said, okay, cool. Why? I'm a runner. I'm useless with balls. He's like, no. How many referees are on the field? I don't know. He's like, well, you get one behind one goal, one behind another goal, one running in the middle. Then you get the water boys and girls coming in and out. He said the energy sector is exactly the same. You have so many institutions trying to have a crack at policy and no one actually knows what's going on at any given point in time. I'm being facetious, but that's a really big thing. We've got retailers who are having a go at this stuff now. We've got all kinds of interesting and innovative stuff that's happening. Most of it's happening behind the scenes. So yeah, it's hugely exciting from my position. We don't want to get our fingers burned. So what we do is consult nicely with everybody. We don't really mind how AMO and ENA end up finalizing this, because as far as we're concerned, as a software company, it's do we license our software to party A or to party B? Privately, I don't say this in front of our CFO because it makes him nervous. But yeah, it's middleware with software behind the scenes.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Crikey, time flies when you're having fun. PhD students in the back, very quiet.
Hello. Hi.
Oh,
Did you want to?
No, I didn't see you. Please.
Yeah, I work for Gemini. We own an electricity distribution business in Victoria.
Indeed you are. We work with you guys too.
Good stuff. And I'm sure we'd be very interested in doing a pilot.
Sure you would.
But yeah, especially if Arena pays for half of it.
No comment.
What I'm more interested in, well, what I'm interested in today is where do you think the efficient, I mean, I'm an economist too, so apologies to everyone else
Great
in
company.
the room. But I guess economists are familiar with the idea of like aggregated, operation of batteries and coordination is almost certainly going to be more efficient. So I guess my question to you, given the predicted take-up rate of batteries in Australia, is where should these batteries actually exist from a lowest cost energy system point of view? I mean, I've got rooftop solar on my house because it makes sense as an individual, but I still don't understand whether that's efficient from a whole energy system, lowest cost point of view. I mean, what's your view on, and yet, it's happening. The only problem that exists in energy policy that most governments want to address is the lack of rooftop solar.
Yeah.
So where should batteries exist, and from an efficiency perspective, and how might your system help us move towards that? I mean, the AER have taken a view that it shouldn't be, they shouldn't be owned by networks, but beyond that, we're not sure.
Are you asking as Gemini or as the economist? I'm just joking. It's a really good question. The answers got different facets, put it that way. When South Australia announced the 50,000 batteries prior to the last election, I was over in DPC in Adelaide, the Department of Premier and Cabinet, talking about how software like this helps them understand where the batteries are needed. What lies behind this, paraphrasing hugely, is effectively a Google heat map. Right? We understand on the basis of what the network knows, so taking directly from their GIS systems, what assets are best placed where. We said, don't worry, South Australian government, we can take this information from SAPN, we can show it to you in a really user-friendly way, and you can actively encourage batteries in places where it's beneficial to the network. And the government lady looked at me and shook her head slowly and said, that's lovely, Doug, but we want to put it in social housing. To which I was like, whoa, 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 hang on. No, that's a great outcome. That's a fantastic idea. I love the idea. What about social housing where there's a network problem? And she said, no, we can't be choosy like that. It's got to go in social housing, irrespective of where the social housing is. I said, okay, great, but your colleagues in SAPN down the road aren't going to necessarily like this very much. As in, a battery in one place, from a physics perspective, is not equal to a battery in another place. And the commercial returns on the battery in A and B are also different. And she said, well, that's life. So, slight problem. Second slight problem is knowledge and understanding of the LV assets themselves. There are very few networks worldwide who genuinely know the carrying load capabilities of LV at that very fringe level. Most can tell you at the pole top sub, zone sub, that kind of thing. Very few can tell you, okay, on this particular street or even in this particular suburb, it's this street or that street, so on. So there is an information asymmetry that everybody conveniently ignores. Networks have never needed to know it in the past. Now they kind of do, but getting it would be hideously expensive. What we have already demonstrated is that when you have a certain number of assets available, the information from those assets, those 15 data streams that our dear colleagues in Tesla aren't using, help inform the deployment of the next assets. It's a virtuous circle. The more you know, the more targeted you can be, etc. Not quite sure how that's going to pan out. I'm also not quite sure how it's going to pan out when the government then produces a website that says, go for it, which is politics. So it's a complicated question. Some of your Gemini colleagues in Oviedo, is it called? And I have been having a bit of a chat about how this would work in real life. Who wants to join the party? Food for thought over time. I think it's going to be actually a virtuous cycle. The more we know, the better we can do it. Micronodal pricing, the same thing. Gets economists really hot under the collar and excited, right? Actually, if you knew what the asset was telling you about the voltage in a particular area, you should know, you should be able to reverse engineer what the price should be at that network for consuming power at any given point in time. And it's not hideously complicated. So yeah, TBD, but for economists, it's gonna be a lot of fun work in the future. Yeah. Gentlemen, please.
Thanks, Doug.
Pleasure.
A couple of comments and then a big question.
Please.
When I was involved in this stuff back in the 90s, there were two concepts that we were imbued with, part of our thinking. One is that the whole electricity generation is a natural monopoly, and that we've made a mess out of basically privatizing bits of it to the point where we have to fiddle around with the market as we are. The other one was that within any of these areas, the idea of the heat sink, when we were talking about district heating, having a large sink that you can put things in. And one of the things that seems to me that we have not really developed here in Australia is the idea of pumped hydro as a way of actually absorbing what is surplus and then giving us some of that stability. But behind that, I'm involved in the Labour Environment Action Network, who probably can claim some credit for driving the Labour Party's policy on energy. And our next agenda is going to be to pick up this idea of the Green New Deal, investment in sustainability. If we are going to make major investment, and I think we will over the next possibly two parliaments, major investment in this, where would you say is the most efficient, most important investment, or maybe a suite of them? Which are the ones that, if we're going to talk about putting public money into this system, where would it be most effective in sorting out the problems that you've identified today?
Wow, this is massively outside the scope of GreenSync. Fantastic job, first and foremost. Keep it up on the Labour Party. That's the easy bit. Pumped hydro, you conflated the concept of thermal storage or heat storage and energy storage. Not necessarily bad. Both are extremely valuable. I think the really interesting thing for me as the economist looking at this with relatively fresh eyes is the transfer of balance sheet. How many batteries were sold in Australia last year? Residential batteries, do you have any idea? There's a gentleman called Warwick Johnson from Sunwiz. He's a nice guy. I've been on a few panels with him. He reckons it's about 45,000, 50,000. I don't know the latest info, but of that order. Right? Who paid for them? Private individuals. Private individuals off their own net salaries or their savings. That is a staggeringly inefficient way to finance anything. As an economist, I roll over and quail, right? But the point being, people are choosing themselves. They're voting with their feet, literally and figuratively. If they are going to do that, there are much more effective things they could be investing in. Solar hot water, thermal storage, that's what I thought you were going to go for. If they're going to do something which is good for the environment, lowers their bills, is relatively cheap, a lithium-ion battery in the garage remains a relatively expensive way to store power. Pumped hydro, with a couple of notable geographic exceptions, where I think there's an ex-quarry up in Queensland that they're converting into a pumped hydro scheme at the moment, is also a very expensive way. If I were government and I had an infinite pot of money, I would invest it in de-risking finance for other people. I wouldn't go after Snowy 2.0. That's a joke. I wouldn't go after massive pumped hydro schemes. They're good for jobs, but they're terrible use of economic funds. They're good for super funds to come in behind you, I suppose, if you're that way inclined. I'd look at how do you get the best bang for buck from people's personal desire to buy these things anyway. I quite like, leaving aside the challenges of how it's being done, I quite like the theory of helping consumers to roll out 90,000 batteries in South Australia. That's a chunk of money. The government said, this is a social good. I'm going to put it to give a subsidy to anybody who's in theory eligible, with a favor towards people who are in social housing or in economic difficulties. Whether or not I would have chosen residential batteries is a different question, but I quite like the idea of de-risking the mass rollout of these technologies. What I would stress, and I have to say this because I work for GreenSync, but I actually believe it too, is that you need to be very careful of unintended consequences. 90,000 batteries, if you're a retailer, forgive me pointing at you, sir, but you work for Red, so it's very easy. If you're a retailer and you work out there in the great wide world and you hear there's 90,000 batteries being rolled out, the first thing you say is, let's aggregate them and take them to wholesale market. Let's take them to spot. It's worth a lot of money. Somebody else is investing the capital in the asset. I'm very happy to aggregate it on their behalf. I'm going to take it to spot at vol. The customer's not vol exposed. I'm going to score 14.5 per megawatt hour. I'm going to pay the customer $100 in cinema tickets, and they're going to be happy. Right? CredinSync sees this every day, and we're like, oh, come on, you know. So I just, that unintended consequence. And if you have 90,000 batteries or whatever it may be, the concept of bringing those into the system in such a way that they could actually cause damage, binding or unbinding constraints by accident, because the distribution business, cue my friend from Gemini, just going, where the hell did this come from? We've got no visibility behind the meter. And all of a sudden, we've got reverse power flows on a particular asset. What? And it's because of the gradual but persistent rollout of DER. So,
All right, Doug.
I'm happy to stay on. I appreciate there's a couple more. It's up to you guys. Do you need to pull out of time? There's one gentleman in the back who's been extremely patient. So I'll take one more. I feel pity. Poor dude. Yeah, please.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
My question relates more to the consumer. You've been talking about distributed power systems, and that would involve quite a bit of communication amongst assets. And by definition, there'd be a lot of flexibility in the system.
Yes, sir.
Right. Now, with the assets, for example, batteries, that implies that there's going to be a lot more shuffling around of electricity from one asset to the other. Mm-hmm. And that could be an unexpected consequence, is that there's going to be more load on these devices because there'll be more shuffling, more charging and discharging and moving of electricity. Mm-hmm. And given that batteries also have a limited time span, maybe 10 years, 15 years, probably if you're lucky.
10,000 cycles is the usual.
That's huge capital expense from private investors, from consumers. Mm. And given that there would be a lot of extra shuffling and wear and tear on these devices, I'd like to hear your comments on how that's been accounted for in your modelling and the extra wear and tear. Now, for another example is solar panels. A lot of people are not fully aware that solar panels lose around about 0.35% of their efficiency every year, which after 10, 15, 20 years is going to build up to a significant amount. I mean, are we going to have in 20 years' time a situation where a lot of batteries are dying and a lot of consumers are getting very upset, and you've got a situation where you've allowed private investors like Joe Bloggs to invest a lot of their money, whereas previously this money was taken up by the public, by government, and so you've got private individuals investing in infrastructure. I mean, is that an animal just waiting to pounce out in the future?
Really interesting question. A couple of comments at a high level, and I don't pretend to be the nth expert in these things, but payback on a solar panel today with a feed-in tariff in Victoria, 3.5 years, depending on your installation costs. I mean, again, I'm not the latest and greatest expert, but from what I understand, and I don't have PV because unfortunately I live in a flat, about 3.5 years from what I understand. Some houses, if you can oversize it, 3 years. So in theory, if all those things are true, by the time you get to year 10 of your economic model, the panel's not only long since paid off, but you've made so much money that the chances are you don't mind buying a new one. Now, I appreciate that's in the future, and that may or may not be an appropriate sort of way to think about these things, but a 10-year asset life on a residential white good, think your washing machine, think your fridge freezer, that's pretty good going. And if, well, the poor people, this is where I believe the best appropriate use of government finance is actually helping to bring more of those panels into homes. But then you get into an aggregation challenge and you get into a network impact challenge. And that's where I think the second argument, which is a slightly different one, is in assets which the payback isn't so good, or they have a very finite cycle. So for example, Tesla's 10,000 cycles warranty mind, not necessarily that it's going to just stop after that. But they guarantee 10,000 cycles at, I think it's a 96% productive efficiency or something. I can't remember the exact numbers. But in any case, you're seeing a very, very, very slight engineering loss over time. We would argue, intellectually and economically, that if that customer is getting money for providing service to the grid, that improves the payback on their asset, that is good. That's reduced the payback period, and it's made the money cash in hand, whether that's an upfront discount, which is what we're seeing in South Australia, or whether it's a direct payment, $100 worth of cinema tickets, whatever it may be. We would therefore argue, intellectually and economically, that it's a better outcome for the customer to be doing something for their community. They'll be paid for it, and it improves the payback on their asset. Does it reduce the technical functionality of the asset? 10,000 cycles is still a lot. We're not talking about cycling these things every day. In our experience with DEX so far, we're not talking about doing lots of high volume transactions. The world you're talking about is a long way in the future for us. We're seeing 5 or 6 days a year when support is needed for the grid today. Maybe in 3 years hence, because we've got this market infrastructure, you decide to trade power with the wonderful gentleman who doesn't mind me using him as an example in a tan jacket. But that's a bilateral private transaction. He is presumably paying you enough that you think it's worth your while. Presumably, otherwise you'd say no. Or you'd say, no, my battery's mine, and so be it. But for those 45,000 customers who've bought batteries in the last year in this country, they're doing it purely on the basis of behind the meter arbitrage. My calculation of their paybacks, assuming they have diverse assets and they've spent roughly 13 grand per and about 2 grand installation and blah, 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 blah. Again, arm's length removed. Their payback's about 9 years. It's pretty rubbish for a white good. You could have better ways to spend your money. So why are they buying them anyway? I think it's a big, I won't use the language, but you know, bugger off, thank you, to retailers. Forgive me again, sir. I'm really picking on you today, sorry. But people just don't like the retailers. Residential retail prices in this country have risen 100% in 5 years. If you're your average punter out in the street, that is political gold, but also economically devastating. So people are saying, well, you know what, screw it. I don't know where the prices are going in the future. I'll buy a battery today and I'll tell my retailer to get stuffed. The problem with doing that, ironically, they've made the situation worse for the people who don't have access to that capital. If I opt out of the system, the remainder of you lot have to bear the cost of the system that I've opted out of. Lucky for me, sucks for you. If we're seeing that to the tune of 90,000 assets in South Australia, the poor people in social housing who don't happen to live on the top floor with a solar panel and an opportunity for a battery actually pay more for the system. And as an economist, something inside me dies in that moment. But these are fantastic questions. I'm afraid, you know, as GreenSync, I'm not necessarily the sort of the font of all knowledge.
All right,
Thank you very much.
ladies and gentlemen, please join me. Give him a good round of applause. Thank you. So we still have upcoming seminars here at the Climate Energy College here today in this office. The talk by Professor Ross Garnett is 4th edition in the 6th, and topics of transforming land use processes and food productions and consumption. In the 15th of May, we have Frank Josso and John Wiseman facing our code.
I'm just going to interrupt. That one's actually not happening anymore, so just ignore that.
Thank you, Nitz. And the 16th of May, we have Andrew King here at Climate Energy College office and understanding future climates using model time slicing. Thank you so much again for joining us and have a beautiful lunch.